Why did Boeing pay $4.7 billion to buy back its own supplier? In 2005, Boeing sold its commercial airplane factories in Wichita, Tulsa, and McAllister to a Canadian investment firm called 1X for about $900 million in cash. Boeing said the deal, including long-term supply agreements, would create ongoing savings. 20 years later, Boeing completed an all-stock acquisition of the company. Those factories became Spirit AeroSystems, not Spirit Airlines. The equity value was about $4.7 billion. That does not mean Boeing simply lost $3.8 billion. The two transactions covered different assets, liabilities, and dollar values, and Spirit had become a much larger company. But it does reveal a spectacular reversal. Boeing had transferred ownership of a factory it wanted to treat like an outside supplier, without ending its dependence on what that factory built. When the arrangement came under pressure, any savings had not eliminated the consequences, returning to Boeing. And that is the kind of hidden machinery this channel follows. The decision that looks efficient today, and the bill that arrives years later. If you like stories where the balance sheet collides with the real world, subscribe, tap like, and ring the bell. Now, back to Wichita. Because Boeing's supplier began as Boeing itself. The aircraft manufacturing story in Wichita began with Lloyd Stearman's factory in 1927. A Boeing-affiliated holding company acquired Stearman in 1929, and the operation became Boeing's Wichita division in 1941. The site went on to support military aircraft and generations of Boeing jetliners. By the early 2000s, Wichita was not a side workshop that Boeing could replace with a few purchase orders. It built complete 737 fuselages and major structures for other Boeing commercial programs. Still, Boeing was trying to reduce costs and make its commercial airplane business less capital-intensive. On June 16, 2005, it sold substantially all of the Wichita operation, along with commercial facilities in Tulsa and McAllister, to 1X. The deal brought Boeing roughly $900 million in cash, transferred certain liabilities to the buyer, and locked in long-term supply agreements. The human transition was more complicated than the word sale suggests. Every employee in the division left Boeing's payroll, and roughly 9,300 workers received notices as part of a separation and re-employment process. That figure does not mean 9,300 jobs permanently disappeared. It means thousands of people had to leave Boeing before the new company could hire its workforce. The operation was briefly called Midwestern Aircraft Systems, then became Spirit AeroSystems. Boeing had sold the factory. It had not stopped needing the fuselages. At first, the separation looked like a private equity success story. Spirit began with about 75 years of inherited manufacturing experience, expanded beyond Boeing, and started supplying Airbus programs as well. It went public in November 2006. By the time 1X sold its final Spirit stake in 2014, the investment firm said it had received about $3.2 billion in aggregate proceeds over 9 years, 8.5 times its invested capital. That was aggregate money received, not a claim that every dollar was accounting profit. For Boeing, the attraction was different. Spirit owned the factories, carried the payroll, and operated under supply contracts instead of inside Boeing's corporate structure. The problem was that a change in ownership did not create a substitute. Spirit remained a single-source supplier for crucial Boeing structures, including most of the 737 airframe. And by 2023, Boeing still accounted for 64% of Spirit's revenue. So the companies were independent in the legal sense and tightly coupled in the operational one. Spirit needed Boeing's production rate to stay healthy. Boeing needed Spirit's factories to build airplanes. Neither side had a quick replacement for the other. That dependence became dangerous when the 737 MAX stopped moving through the system. After the worldwide MAX grounding, Boeing directed Spirit to suspend MAX deliveries beginning in January 2020. At the time, the program represented more than half of Spirit's revenue. Spirit announced about 2,800 layoffs in Wichita, an actual workforce cut separate from the 9,300 transition notices issued in 2005. Then the pandemic compounded the interruption. When aircraft production began climbing again, the pressure changed shape. Inflation, labor turnover, rework, and fixed-price contracts squeezed Spirit as it tried to raise output. In 2023, then Chief Executive Tom Gentile described the economics of majors contracts and Boeing and Airbus contracts as not sustainable. Reuters reported $4 billion in forward losses, meaning expected costs had already outrun expected revenue on work Spirit was still obligated to complete. Spirit reported a net loss of $616 million for 2023. The supplier was outside Boeing, but Boeing could not behave like an ordinary customer, walking away from a bad vendor. It needed the production to continue. In April 2024, Boeing agreed to advance Spirit $425 million to help cover inventory and cash flow pressure, even as acquisition negotiations continued. Boeing had moved much of the factory's financial risk outside the company, only to discover that a critical supplier's financial risk could still become Boeing's problem. The financial squeeze was only half of the story. In 2023, Boeing and Spirit disclosed several manufacturing problems, including improperly drilled fastener holes in some 737 aft pressure bulkheads. Boeing said that issue did not pose an immediate safety of flight concern for airplanes already in service, but inspections and rework delayed deliveries. Each defect also raised a harder question. When one company builds the structure and another company accepts, integrates, and certifies the airplane, where does responsibility actually sit? On January 5, 2024, Alaska Airlines Flight 1282 climbed out of Portland with a Boeing 737 9-door plug that should have been secured by 4 bolts. Near 14,830 feet, the left mid-exit door plug moved upward and separated from the airplane, causing rapid depressurization and substantial damage. 7 passengers and 1 flight attendant suffered minor injuries, and no one was transported to a hospital. The investigation traced the work across the Boeing-Spirit boundary. The fuselage had arrived from Spirit with 5 discrepant rivets installed by one of Spirit's suppliers. At Boeing's Renton factory, Boeing personnel opened the door plug so Spirit contractors could perform the rivet rework. No required removal record was created. Photographs and physical evidence showed that the 4 bolts meant to stop the plug from moving upward were not reinstalled. The final NTSB report did not conclude that Spirit caused the accident. It found the probable cause was Boeing's failure to provide adequate training, guidance, and oversight for its parts removal process. It also found that ineffective FAA oversight contributed. The accident mattered to the buyback story because it made the fragmented workflow visible. A supplier-originated rivet discrepancy crossed into a Boeing factory. A Boeing door plug removal was not documented, and a Boeing airplane left without the securing bolts. Outsourcing had divided the work. It had not divided the consequences. On January 31, 2024, Boeing's then chief executive, David Calhoun, said the company's outsourcing had probably gone too far. Boeing confirmed acquisition talks with Spirit on March 1st and announced a definitive agreement on July 1st. The headline number was $4.7 billion. But this was not a cash payment, and it was not the price of simply repurchasing the same 3 factories. The agreement valued Spirit's equity at about $4.7 billion in Boeing stock, or $37.25 per Spirit share, and valued the transaction at about $8.3 billion when Spirit's net debt was included. Spirit had also grown into a supplier for Boeing's main rival, which meant Boeing could not take the whole company unchanged. Airbus acquired the Spirit work packages dedicated to Airbus aircraft and received $439 million in compensation when that transaction closed. Other assets went through separate sales. On December 8, 2025, Boeing completed its acquisition. The Boeing package included commercial operations in Wichita, Dallas, and Tulsa, major structures for the 737, 767, 777, and 787 aftermarket operations, and selected work in Belfast. About 15,000 people across 5 sites joined Boeing. 20 years after the original sale, the industrial core of Boeing's own supplier was back under Boeing ownership. But ownership was only the beginning of the repair. So, why did Boeing pay $4.7 billion to buy back its own supplier? Because Boeing had separated ownership from responsibility, but never separated itself from the factory's output. The 2005 deal moved facilities, employees, and near-term cost pressure outside Boeing. It did not create another company capable of replacing Spirit when the MAX stoppage, contract losses, production strain, and quality failures piled up. Boeing still had to support production, and Boeing still held final responsibility for the airplanes carrying its name. Bringing Spirit's Boeing work back inside the company creates a clearer chain of control, which is the rationale Boeing gave for the acquisition. It does not prove that the acquisition has already fixed Boeing's quality problems. The NTSB's final finding identified deficiencies inside Boeing itself, and the December 2025 deal brought Spirit's operational and financial problems under the same roof, rather than making them disappear. The lesson is not that every outsourced part should be built in-house. It is that when a supplier is impossible to replace, its risks never fully leave your balance sheet or your responsibility. Stay sharp, stay curious, and always ask why, guys.